반갑습니다. 오늘 조금만 한국말로 할 거, 그 다음에 너무 많이 기지발하세요. 렉처는 영어로 할게요. 근데 첫 번째, 제가 34년 전에 여기 한국에 왔다가 저 평화봉사단원으로 왔는데, 저 거제도에서 평화봉사단원으로 근무했고, 저 작은 보건소에 근무했어요. 근데 크동 그 3년 동안 살아가다 미국에 돌아갔어요. 근데 이번에 오면은 맨날 몇 번째 갔다 왔는데 이번에 오면은 한국은 너무 많이 달랐어요. 근데 거제도에 사는 저 한국 사람에게 많이 배웠어요. 그 아름다운 나라하고 저 한국 음식 먹고 많이 착한 한국 사람 많은데, 그래서 오늘 여러분한테 조금씩 가르쳐줄 수 있으면 기분이 좋겠어요. So my topic today is to hopefully teach you a little bit about commercializing drugs. As you heard, my background is in business. So I'm going to focus more on the business topics because I think you have a lot of wonderful scientists here to talk about some of the science. But I will talk about some of the science in the CNS and oncology areas. And so I'm going to go through two examples. The first one is going to be CNS, and I'll explain how a very large company was looking to find drugs outside of their company to in-license. And so we help them prioritize what to look for and how to evaluate good drugs to in-license. And then the second example is in oncology, and we'll talk a little bit about a company that had a particular compound or capability and how we help them decide how to prioritize which type of cancer to go after with that compound. So I think the most important thing, and you'll hear me repeat this many times in my talk today, is when you think about the commercial opportunity of your drug, you really need to think about things in three categories. So the first one is the commercial opportunity. And this is probably the last thing that most people think about, but it's something that you really need to think about from the very beginning when you're developing your product. Because I think you're all trying to run a business, and to run a business, you have to understand what the commercial opportunity is. So on commercial opportunity, we always look at where's their unmet need. So I think as Mr. Wu was talking about in the orphan disease area, there's a lot of unmet need. Maybe small patient population, but many people have not focused on them. So a very large unmet need, and that's what makes orphan drugs and orphan indications attractive very often. So how big is the patient population? How many competitors are there? How many things are in development? So are there a lot of pipeline drugs in the pipeline that might compete against your product or not? This is one that's very important, and the last portion of my talk today, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about pricing and reimbursement. And then lastly, how many people do you have to call on? How many doctors are there? How hard is it to sell and market? And how expensive is it? So I think all of these things you need to think about, even in the earliest stages in the lab, when you're looking at what you're trying to develop. What really is your goal at the end of all of that research? What is your goal, and how much money can it bring to your company? Obviously, the technical feasibility is very important. Are there good preclinical models that might make a target more attractive? If you understand more about the disease, the pathophysiology, the etiology, then maybe that's something you want to prioritize. How much knowledge is there about the pathways and where you need to intervene in the disease? And then just the mechanistic rationale. Does it make sense that going after a certain target really might have benefits for the disease that you're trying to cure or improve the treatment for? And then third is development ease. So you want to look and prioritize when you're trying to decide either what particular drug to in-license or disease, type of cancer or type of CNS disease. What's the regulatory pathway? Is it clear? Is it well documented? documented? Is it long? Is it short? Expensive? A lot of patients or not? How easy or difficult is that regulatory pathway? And part of that is, in the trial, do you have good endpoints? Do you have clear endpoints? And that's something where in oncology often there are clearer endpoints than in some of the CNS drugs where there are more qualitative endpoints. Maybe on a pain drug, you have to fill out just a qualitative scorecard to decide, did this patient have improvement? And so there's a lot of placebo effect, and sometimes it's very hard to get good results. So I chose the two examples today because they're very different. If you think about oncology and CNS, there are many, many things that are different about them, and it makes good examples. So oncology, it's very precise, much more precise than CNS for the diagnosis. Biomarkers have become very routine now, but that's not true in CNS. Targeted therapies, because we've identified many biomarkers in oncology, there's more targeted therapies that are used for the diseases. But again, CNS is not very specific on many of the therapies. The route of administration is important, and what route you choose to develop your drug. In oncology, most things are still IV, but there are some oral. Almost everything in the CNS area is oral. So you can see all of the differences between these drugs, and hopefully using these two examples will give you a better understanding of the range of things that you need to think about when you're commercializing your products. So we'll talk first about the CNS example. And here I've outlined not all CNS diseases, but many of the CNS diseases. So you can see, interesting, most of the companies that have focused on the CNS area to date have focused on developing drugs for the psychiatric diseases, and then some in pain, and a little bit in epilepsy and multiple sclerosis. But until recently, not a lot of companies have focused on some of the neurologic diseases, so Huntington's, Parkinson's, and those are very, very difficult diseases to address. But because there aren't still good solutions, there's a lot of great commercial opportunity. So one of the things that you also need to think about when you're developing your drug for CNS is, again, who you're going to sell it to. And if you look across just examples of different drugs within the CNS area, you can see these are who prescribes those drugs, the primary prescribing people. So if you're going to develop something for depression, then your call point, the people that you need to work with to develop the drug and see how they're going to prescribe the drug are going to be more psychiatrists and a little bit on primary care. But if you're going to develop something like Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis, then that's more call point of neurology. And then in the middle, these dark blue areas, that's the call point. The main prescribers are the PCPs, the primary care physicians. And in the U.S., there's about 250,000 primary care physicians. So ultimately, if you make a successful drug that is used prescribed by primary care physicians, you have to think about how you're going to market that. Are you going to have a really big sales force that's going to call on 250,000 primary care physicians, or are you going to co-market? Are you going to do a partnership, or are you going to out-license to some other company that has a strong primary care marketing group, and maybe you focus on the area that has a smaller number of physicians? So the example here that we'll talk about is, it was a large multinational company that had some very early stage CNS compounds in development, but they were so early, it was going to be a long time until they got to commercial, onto the market. And so they needed something to fill their pipeline that was later stage compounds. And they came to our company to ask for help to identify some later stage compounds, help them choose between many late stage compounds in the CNS area. And so what we did was we looked across all of those CNS diseases that I showed you earlier, and we narrowed it down to a smaller number. So Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, neuropathic pain, insomnia, and depression. So in these diseases, then we looked at each of these in a lot more detail to help them figure out what was available, what did we think had a good chance of success, that had a good market. And ultimately, the first deal they did was they in-licensed a very large CNS drug. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through that process of how we helped them narrow that down. So first of all, we think again about the commercial factors. So of those drugs that we looked, or of the diseases in CNS that we looked at several of these commercial factors. So how big was the population? What was the total revenue size of current companies competing there? What did we think the revenue, did it have a big chance of growing, or was it going to be flat? How many physicians, a lot of physicians, or maybe fewer physicians? So we rated along each of these dimensions for each of these conditions. We gave the scores to the different drugs and the different conditions. And so when we looked at the commercial factors, Alzheimer's was one that was very attractive. So you never find, when you do this sort of exercise, you never have all the blue balls in the same column, right? There's blue balls, there's white balls, some things are good, some things are not as good, but you have to prioritize and pick where the majority are the best. And so on the commercial factors, Alzheimer's looked very attractive. And then we looked at some of the technical feasibility and clinical feasibility. We looked at things and competitiveness. So were there a lot of things in the pipeline or a few? And then how big was the unmet need? So again, we wanted to look at all of those 6 or 7 diseases and rate them on unmet need and then their pipeline. And when we did that, the things in this quadrant, those are the things that scored the best on those dimensions. And the size of the ball was how big was the market in 2010. So Alzheimer's disease, the ball wasn't very big, but it was because there were no good solutions, no good drugs. It had the potential to be very big. And then in the psychosis, so there's a number of things that we put together there, depression, schizophrenia, a number of other things in that ball, so, and neuropathic pain. So along these dimensions, they scored very well. And then we looked at other issues related to Alzheimer's. So we took Alzheimer's as an example, and we tried to look in more detail about what might be good or what might be hard about developing a drug for Alzheimer's or in-licensing a drug for Alzheimer's. And so first of all, it's a growing population because it's correlated with old age, and the elderly population is growing, so that's good news from the commercial point of view. Interestingly enough, in the U.S., the sales actually have gone down in the last few years, not because the patient population has gone down, but because there haven't been new drugs that have come out as solutions, and the old drugs have had their prices pushed down. So even though now it's only about $3 billion in the U.S., it really has the potential to be much, much bigger if we have a disease-modifying drug that comes to market and is successful. So there was still a huge unmet need, but it was also very competitive. So back in 2007, when we started this work, it was extremely competitive. Many, many companies were looking at the neurodegenerative diseases and trying to find solutions because they saw that there was a big unmet need and a big market potential. So that was something that they needed to figure out. It's going to be a very competitive area if they try to in-license candidates in that area. And the other challenge was from the, if we look at the science part, people were still trying to figure out, and they still today are trying to figure out, what is really the best mechanism of a drug for Alzheimer's. So most of the early drugs were all focused on the beta-amyloid targets, and as you probably know, there have been many failures in beta-amyloid targets. That doesn't mean that it's the wrong target or a bad target. So, but people don't understand yet why those drugs have failed. So is it the wrong target, or maybe the drugs just didn't get to the target to have efficacy? But there are many, many other mechanisms, other targets that there were drugs in development. And so the challenge was, how do you pick which target? If you want to in-license a drug, how do you know which one you should be in-licensing? So for each of those different targets, we helped our client do an analysis, and this is just an example of one target. But we put together a summary looking at all of the different companies that were developing drugs focused on that target, where were they in development, what had been their clinical success to date, and really compared all of these within each of the target areas so that we could understand, where was the best chance of success. And working with our client's R&D team, where was their expertise, where did they feel that they understood the science the best to in-license a drug and continue commercialization. So we looked at the scientific issues, we looked at the clinical issues, the commercial issues, all of those together. You need to think of all of them when you're deciding what drug you want to in-license, or even in your own portfolio, what you want to put forward to the next end. And don't just think only about the science when you're putting the drugs through your pipeline. So now we're going to talk about oncology. This was a little bit different client situation. So I mentioned this was a company that had really good science inside, and what they wanted to do was figure out which particular cancer they should develop a drug based on this target compound for. And so as you know, there are many different types of cancers, and there's no one drug that addresses all cancers. So you have many types of solid tumors, you have many types of hematologic cancers. So it's a challenge to figure out if you have an oncology specialty, but what cancer in particular do you want to focus on? So again, when we looked at all of the cancers, we looked about, what might be the greatest unmet need. So where were there things that still very high unmet need, not good drugs available, not good treatments available. And then where were there still a lot of patients dying in the U.S. And so again, up in this upper right quadrant, we look at non-small cell lung cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer. Along these two dimensions, there was, a lot of unmet need, a lot of people dying. So that's one way to think about what you might prioritize. So let's take breast cancer, for instance. As you know, the targeted therapies have recently, in the last several years, come out, but there are many, many more targeted therapies in development for breast cancer. So there's some excellent therapies already on the market, some real success in treating breast cancer, and there's a lot of therapies, targeted therapies in development. So if you think you want to develop a drug for breast cancer, you really need to look at not just what's on the market, but what's in this pipeline, and how is your drug going to compete with what's in the pipeline. So you have to keep thinking ahead all the time. If you think only about what's on the market now, and you're trying to be better than that, by the time you get on the market, these drugs might be already ahead of you, and you might not be, compete against the new standard of care. So you always have to keep track constantly. What's in development? What's ahead of you? How are they doing? How are you going to compete with those drugs? So in this example, we were looking at a particular target, and if you look, instead of thinking about picking which cancer, you're starting with a target which this company had. They had a very good science to develop compounds that were attracted to the tyrosine kinase inhibitors. But just as an example, many of these targets work across several different types of cancers. And so if you have a certain target, then you have to decide, well, do I first do my trial in breast cancer, or lung cancer, or colorectal cancer, or kidney cancer? If I've got a VEGF compound, which cancer do I develop it for first? So I think I already gave you the background. As I said, this company had novel chemical processes for molecules to tightly bind to the tyrosine kinase inhibitors. So that's what they were focused on. And we were trying to help them decide which cancer to go after. So what we did was we looked at the different kinase targets to see which ones were active in which types of cancers. So in each of the check marks, you can see the match between the type of cancer and where the target had activity. And so those were the things that we put in the top of our screening, what I call our screening funnel. And then we took those targets and those diseases, and we prioritized them. We had to evaluate them on, again, incidence and prevalence, so how many people have those diseases, what's the treatment paradigm currently, what are the drugs that are on the market or in development currently targeting, what are the unmet needs, then look at the positioning, look at the clinical trial, profiling, market and strategic attractiveness. So again, all of those things, as the very beginning of this process, all of those things were considered. So first, to look at the addressable market, what we did was we took these cancers and we said, let's again, just from more the commercial standpoint, how would we rank these different cancers that had the kinase inhibitor activity? So here, it looked like renal cell carcinoma and hepatic cell carcinoma. They ranked very high, also very high price, and a long treatment duration. So long treatment duration is good in this context because they need more drugs. So you sell more drugs with a longer treatment. But then also CML and GIST were also good targets. They rated pretty well, very high price point currently with drugs on the market, and also long time frames. So those were the rankings, just if we think from the commercial point of view. And then we looked at the pipeline to see were there a lot of competitors pursuing the same target, the same type of pathway for drug development. And so again, I have to disguise the information, but our client had, their target was, let's say, target Y. They had target X and target Y. And when we looked at what was in development, not very many things were in development with those same targets. So that was good. They weren't going to have a lot of competitors. Hopefully it was not bad because it wasn't a good target, and that's why people weren't focused on it. But I think it was good because there weren't a lot of competitors, so it was more novel. And then we rated them on rated these diseases, the cancers, on the technical feasibility. So when we looked at that, then CML and GIST rated very high on the technical feasibility. And then we looked at the clinical trial pathway. So then we just took one example. We did this for each of the cancers, but this is just an example for CML. So for CML, we looked at how expensive and how long would it be to do the clinical trial. So the answer was this was not a very difficult or an unusually hard clinical trial pathway. So 20 to 80 patients in phase 1, up to 150 patients in phase 2. The trial length, very typical in phase 2, about 2 years trial. And accrual, so one thing we find is if you have a lot of companies developing drugs for the same target population at the same time, sometimes it's hard to accrue patients because there's a lot of competition to get the patients into your clinical trial. So when we looked at how many clinical trials were going on for the CML patient population, it was kind of a medium level. It wasn't going to be terribly hard to accrue patients. And the cost per patient was medium to low cost. So that seemed like a good opportunity, again, when we look at it from the clinical criteria for picking indication. So we do that for each of those cancers that we selected that had the tyrosine kinase inhibitor activity, and we put it into an Excel model, and we rate each of those cancers. So here, the indications that would be like CML, GIST, RCC, all the different cancer types. And then we rate them, how attractive is each of those from a market perspective, from the clinical trial development perspective, and then the scientific and technical feasibility. And you have to decide, and each company here is a little bit different. Some companies are more risk averse, and they want to weight the technical feasibility higher. Some are more focused on the size of the end market, so for them they want to raise and weight the market attractiveness higher. It depends on where you are with the rest of the drugs in your portfolio, how we rate these. But we rated all those cancers on these criteria. And again, for the target that this client was developing, it appeared that CML was a really good first target, first indication to go after. So it had, they were working on a combined both compound Y and compound X. and there was a big opportunity in CML. Also in GIST, that was also looked like a good opportunity for them. So again, we looked at technical feasibility, development ease, and then the size of the ball is how big the market was, and this was from 2008. So that's just two examples of how you think about, either picking the indication, if you have a certain molecule or a platform technology that you're trying to develop. Early on, you need to think not only about what can you develop scientifically, but where's that money and that time well invested, so that by the time you do all of that research and spend all of that money, do all the clinical trials, maybe 8 or 10 or 12 years later, when you get that drug to market, it's actually going to be a commercial success as well as a clinical success. And so the last section I really want to talk about is pricing and reimbursement. In the US, this is really the most complex area, and it's become more complex and more important in recent years with Obamacare. So first of all, the U.S. healthcare system, you probably know, is very different than Korea. Korea, you have a single payer, the government, one payer, one insurance system. In the U.S., we have really thousands of payers. We have Medicare, which is the government, but some of Medicare is additional private insurance that augments the government insurance. We have Medicaid, and that is managed by each state. So you have to go to 50 different Medicaid organizations if you want them to reimburse your drug in their state. Then we have so many different commercial insurers. We certainly have maybe 10 or 12 really large commercial insurers, payers, but then we have many, many other payers. And so in order to get, if you've done all the work to get your drug approved by FDA, you still need to get it paid for, or it will have very, very small sales. What's happened in recent years in the U.S., and especially with Obamacare, is that we are so much more cost conscious. You used to be able to introduce a new drug, put a high price on it, it would probably get reimbursement, somebody would prescribe it, and it would get used. But now there's so much focus on cost reduction that the payers are really looking for the proof that it's economically a good decision, not only clinically, but economically valid. You can still get some premium pricing, especially if you have orphan diseases where there's not a lot of competition and you have some protection from competition for a period of years. But if you want to get a high price or a premium price, you have to prove to the payers that it's worth spending that extra money. So you have to prove the value of your drug, not just show them the piece of paper that says FDA approved your drug. Therefore, I think Me Too products are becoming less attractive, less successful. There's so many drugs and so many conditions that we have multiple therapies for. We don't need more therapies in areas, more drugs where there's already plenty of choices. So I think there's much more of a focus on really novel and breakthrough drug development in order to have an impact. FDA doesn't want to spend their time looking at kind of copycat or Me Too drugs. They're looking to help evaluate new drugs that are going to provide new solutions. So I talked a lot about the economics. So from a value perspective, you also have to think about value from different perspectives. There's different constituencies. There's the value to maybe the hospital, if it's a hospital drug. There's the value to the payer, the value to the doctor, the value to the patient. So depending on who's paying for it, who's prescribing, who's getting reimbursed, when you do your economic analysis, you really need to think about each individual constituency's economics. So as I mentioned, in the olden days, maybe up until 5 years ago, regulatory approval used to be the biggest hurdle to get your drug into the marketplace and successful in the marketplace. And reimbursement wasn't as difficult, and physician adoption wasn't as difficult. They would ask if you had FDA approval, and then you would go to the next step. But now with Obamacare and the focus on cost reduction, I think reimbursement actually is a more challenging hurdle than FDA approval. In fact, what we see is that sometimes the criteria for FDA approval is easier and lower than the criteria that the payers have for reimbursing a drug, or even that the doctors have for prescribing a drug. So when you think about designing your clinical trials, if you design your clinical trial just to meet this minimum hurdle for FDA, you may get approved, but then you may not get reimbursed, and therefore you won't get prescribed. So then you have to go back and do more studies to meet the criteria that the payers have and that the doctors have. The doctors want to see certain, maybe they want to see longer duration of treatment and follow-up before they start prescribing it to their patients. Maybe they want to see a better safety profile. But it's really important to be thinking about these criteria when designing your trial so that you set maybe higher hurdles for your clinical trial, the hurdles that will meet the reimbursement and the prescribing requirements. So I've talked about FDA has to approve your drug, CMS and private payers and Medicaid, they have to decide, are they going to cover your drug, and if they're going to cover it, how much are they going to reimburse it? But then often there's still another step, and another step, especially for really expensive drugs. So if you have a very expensive oncology drug or orphan disease drug, then often for each patient that gets treated with that drug, you have to get special approval and permission from the insurance company. So even if in general they say, yes, we'll cover it, but they'll put criteria on, and some of those criteria require what we call pre-authorization, or maybe step edits. Well, this patient has to take drug A, and then drug B, and drug C, and if they fail those first 3 drugs, then we'll let you prescribe the more expensive drug. So it's very important to understand all of these steps. Again, it doesn't just stop when you get the FDA approval. So I talked a little bit about all of these different constituencies, right? We have the insurers that you have to talk to and tell them about your drug, tell them about the clinical efficacy and safety, and tell them about the economic profile. So if they spend money on your drug, where are they going to save money? Right? That's what they're asking everybody these days. Well, you asked me to spend $10,000 for this drug for this patient. How is that going to save money? We have groups called pharmacy benefit managers. Those are organizations both within insurers and standalone companies, and they put the list of drugs together in tiers on where they're going to get reimbursed, so high reimbursement or lower reimbursement. So you have to build out your organization to have people that call on all of these payers. It's a lot of infrastructure within the pharmaceutical companies just to deal with this issue of getting payment. And then how much you get reimbursed is different depending on if your drug is used in a hospital or given in a physician office, or maybe the patient picks it up in the pharmacy. So there's different reimbursement levels in each of those areas to understand. And just in closing, just as an example, you can see across a number of different cancer drugs, the difference in price. So these drugs here, shown here, go anywhere from $24,000 for a course of therapy up to $110,000 for a course of therapy. And often it's inversely correlated with the size of the patient population, because most of these companies have to invest the same amount of money to get their drug to market. So if that drug is only going to be used in 9,000 patients, then you can charge more because you have to make your return on investment. But in non-small cell lung cancer, for instance, a bigger population, so a lower price. So there's a great range of possible prices, and you need to do this pricing and economic analysis to decide, well, how should our drug be priced? What's it worth? So that's the end. Questions? There's time.
チームですして注意していますが、はい。
Thanks, Paula, for a nice presentation. And this is Linda Shah from Johnson & Johnson. You gave 2 case studies which happened a couple of years ago, and one is CNS area for AD. Obviously, AD is a very hard area, also it's a very difficult area. And in addition to beta amyloid and how those targets are also neuroprotection very important. So is there any significant progress after your recommendation in recent years? So that's the first question for CNS therapy. Second case study about oncology that you mentioned in 2008. That time EGFR and others are pretty hard topic, but right now FGFR and others could be replaced EGFR. So will you change your recommendation list? Thank you.
The billion-dollar questions. First of all, remind you that I'm not the scientist here. So maybe you can ask that question of some of the other scientists, but I'll give you a little bit of an answer. So I think from what I understand in the work, in Alzheimer's disease, certainly a lot of people are talking about tau as a target. I would say that's probably the target that's getting the most discussion right now. And all of those other targets, I think, my sense is people have no idea whether they're going to work or not. They're experimenting, they're trying, they don't understand really the mechanisms and what's going to work. But I guess from talking with the scientists, the researchers that we talked to, and the doctors, probably tau is the one of most interest today, but they aren't giving up on beta amyloid by any means. I mean, people still believe that something with beta amyloid has to work. And oncology, well, I mean, you saw the list of all the targets. I don't think in oncology there is just one good target. I think what we're learning about all of these cancers, the more we dig into the understanding the different, each patient has such a different mechanism, different reason why they got cancer. And so I think we need lots of different mechanisms because there are a lot of subpopulations of patients. And I think we're going to start seeing more combinations of therapies, of even targeted therapies. So I think the most interesting thing, all patients are being typed now to see, what specific gene mutation they may have. So that's helping the focus, but I think what we're finding is there's such heterogeneity in oncology. I think you can't pick one. In breast cancer, I think the biggest unmet need is going after triple-negative breast cancer patients. But and each cancer has a situation like that, where even breast cancer that's very well treated today, there's still a subpopulation in that triple-negative population that is not well treated, and we need solutions. And if you go through each of the other cancers, you have to break it apart into their patient subpopulations and see, where there's the unmet need and specifically what gene mutation is evident in that patient, and so you know which target to pick. I'm sorry, I can't give you one answer.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I have one question in terms of the pricing, drug pricing, and reimbursement system. Korea, the pharmaceutical industry. So right now, the Korean government control has healthcare. The cost is so increased very high. They want to control because of the financial issue. But when they control the drug price, of course there is no option advantage to when Korean pharmaceutical company want to make an innovative drug. Still we are envious about. But once we got that, maybe the drug pricing and reimbursement system is not guaranteed to initiate to develop that drug. So very difficult. So right now is EU and the United States, they pour that good drug in Korea. The Korean pharmaceutical company, about I think 200 or 300 a small company, even one of the big company, still the competition or the capabilities are very poor compared to the EU and the United States pharmaceutical company. So right now we have a lot of problem in Korea. So could you provide some tip how to solve this problem? Maybe so the government right now is push a lot the pharmaceutical company. Right now, this year is okay, but until last year they push a lot. Right now is also they control the hospital, to control healthcare system. So do you have any idea on how to solve this problem? Because we really want to activate the Korean pharmaceutical business to growing up. Looks like we want to be Pfizer and GSK, but right now its current state is very poor. Could you provide some tip about that?
You give me all the very difficult questions today. So, I understand that the Korean system and the price controls, and many other countries have those price controls too, which is why many other countries don't really have a pharmaceutical development business, because you can't afford to develop drugs just for those countries. It's only after you can make your money back in other countries. So I guess, you really have to decide if you want to develop things for the Korean market. Then you either have to talk with the policy people about getting some more flexibility on pricing to encourage, novel innovation, or you're right, nobody will invest because you can't afford to invest, or you need to decide to focus on markets like the US and the EU, where there's more free market pricing. Again, there's a lot of competition on price, and more in those markets too, and the EU has reference pricing, which will cap the price for certain drugs. So, the U.S., one of the reasons why we spend so much on drugs and so much on healthcare is because I think the U.S. companies bear the burden of investing in R&D and taking that risk, and then they have to make the money back first in the U.S., and then they can share those drugs with other countries. But I think you should, if you want freer market pricing, then you need to look at what's needed, where the unmet needs are in the U.S. and maybe the EU, and develop drugs to compete in those markets.
여러 질문 감사드리고요. 쭉 말씀하신 것처럼 아까 CNS 인디케이션을 얘기하셨고 퀄리티 인디케이션을 말씀하셨는데 CNS에는 말씀하신 것처럼 타워가 상당히 좀 타겟을 많은 회사가 하고 있습니다. 경쟁이 아주 심하고요. CNS 자체가 사실 어려운 타겟이기 때문에 해도 얻을 수 있습니다. 어쨌든 지금까지 타워가 제일 좋은 타겟으로 알려져 있고 몽골리스 타겟 많이 보여주셨는데 요즘 많이 하면서도 못한 게 K라스라는 타겟이 있습니다. 상당히 좋은 타겟인데 너무 확보하기 어려운 타겟입니다. 근데 그쪽에 좋은 것만 가지고 계시면 언제든지 라이센스 아웃하실 수 있습니다. 그리고 시간이 11시 55분까지라서 아마 폴라켓에서 남아 계실 거예요. 그리고 오늘 저녁도 같이 하실 거니까 중간중간 또 질문해 주시면 되니까 일단 진행을 위해서 다음으로 넘어가고요. Thank you very much for your nice talk. And I'm going to introduce 수입밥 한국말로 해야 되겠네요. 죄송합니다.